Thanks a million, Clodagh. And good morning, everyone. As Clodagh mentioned there, I work as an employee relations or an ER business partner within our People and Purpose team, which is our HR team here in Deloitte. And I'm here to chat to you today about supporting staff in difficult situations that might arise throughout their employment life cycle. And, in your role as a people manager, how you might best deal with those matters. So it's going to be a really quick whistle stop tour. I hope to have time at the end for any questions that you might have. So do put them in the chat box and hopefully we can get to them at the end as well. In terms of today's agenda, I'm going to touch on a few topics. So I have an overview there. First and foremost, conversations in the workplace, managing low performance, dignity at work or conflict in the workplace, as well as well-being, some takeaways for you, and then we'll hopefully have some time for any Q&As that might be put in the chat at the end of the session. So today's first topic to just touch on is conversations in the workplace. And I guess as a people manager, sometimes we have to have difficult conversations within the workplace. And it's really important that we can have those conversations as effective as possible. The image in front of you now is a really good, I think, summary of how to kind of prep for those conversations. The art of conversation, I suppose, is a skill that really involves connecting with other people through intentional and, I guess, where possible, enjoyable conversations. It can help, build relationships, advance your own career, advance your team members' career, and achieve both your goals as well. It can, on occasion, require overcoming fear, breaking silence, and I suppose choosing appropriate topics and language for different situations as well. So it's a really good summary, I guess, in terms of, having an effective conversation, what should you do in advance? So I guess have a think about what is the intention of the conversation, do some prep in advance, walk in the individual's shoes. So, see where they're coming from. Is there anything else going on that might be affecting, their performance or their conduct? Really important that you show up during those conversations, that you're fully present. You're not distracted by your phone, you haven't got kids kind of crying in the background or emails coming through or anything like that. And really important as well to be quite candid, have that open and honest conversation, and try and nip things in the bud there and then, so it doesn't kind of fall into something bigger at a later date. So the next slide, I appreciate there's quite a lot in it. And as Clodagh mentioned, the slides will be shared afterwards. So definitely a slide that you can have a look back at a later date in advance of maybe prepping for a difficult conversation. And I guess when it comes to these difficult conversations in the workplace, whether it's telling a client you're delayed with a project, or you're presiding over an unenthusiastic performance review, unfortunately all of that is inevitable as part of it being a people manager. So preparation is really key, apologies. So the slide in front of you, it just gives you some tips and guidelines in terms of what you can do in advance of going into that type of conversation. Having a bit of self-talk to yourself in advance, preparing for that, really know what your motive is, what is your intention, ask yourself some questions beforehand in terms of doing that prep. And then keep in mind what you're there to discuss and what the end goal is. And I think, look, we're all human, difficult conversations. No one wants to have them where we can avoid them, absolutely. But people can be emotional at times in the workplace, and that's not, something wrong or something weak. There's 101 things we could all be going through. So it's really important in your role as people managers that you can handle people's emotions the best way you can as well, and be empathetic where possible, and really a listening ear. And there's some techniques there as well. to help guide you on that. So definitely have a look back at those tips and tricks in advance of having to go into a difficult conversation at a later date. I think they're really useful. It's something that I would look into and remind myself in advance of having such a conversation too. Moving on then just to feedback. So I guess giving feedback is one of the most important aspects of every manager's job. So it's really important that we're not afraid to give it. And when feedback is linked to real examples and can be provided clearly and constructively, you can't go wrong. And a good way of doing that is using the earn feedback model, which is outlined on the slide in front of you now. So it gives you the opportunity to provide concise, clear, and actionable feedback for an individual. So the acronym stands for E, event, what was the situation? Be specific with your examples. It is important that an individual understands where exactly they went wrong. A is for action, what was the observed behavior? It's important to try and focus on the behavior and not the person themselves. So try and take that personal aspect away from it. And what did the person do rather than what the person themselves may have a personality attribute. Or for result, what was the result or the consequence? So did something go wrong? What happened? What was the impact on that behavior? And N is for next. So, you could say the most important part of feedback. What are the behaviors that need to be continued or changed? Important that you're agreeing on next steps. Um, so this is a really useful way to frame feedback when you need to deliver it to an individual, and particularly where there are cases of low performance. Improvements benefit everyone within an organization. The individual obviously can grow and gain more satisfaction from their role. A team can learn, new skills to make their lives easier or everyone's lives easier. And that ultimately then impacts the end goal for the organization as well. So just putting that into practice are some examples on the slide now in front of you. So a positive kind of feedback summary using the earn model there at the start. Really important as well, where someone's doing well, give credit where credit is due. Sometimes we forget about doing that as people leaders, and it is really important to acknowledge that when someone's doing well. And then the second example on the slide is around developmental feedback. So we here in Deloitte, we tend to use the word developmental when there are concerns that need to be brought to an individual's attention. When we think back to the art of conversation and the language we use, the term developmental is just a little bit more positive than, let's say, using negative feedback. So I'd encourage you to maybe start bringing that term into your conversations with your team members as well when you're talking about feedback. So you can see I've broken down each example into the event, the action, the result, and the next. So it's a good way to frame your summary feedback to share with an individual, and something that you maybe can look back at a later date as well. So moving then on to our second topic for today, and probably maybe the first thing that comes to mind when you think about difficult situations in the workplace is managing low performance. So first up, I have some guiding principles that can assist when you're managing low performance within an organization. And it really does nearly kind of go back to the art of conversation and doing your prep. So the first one there is about acting in a timely manner. Don't wait, act there and then, deal with it as it presents. Be caring, understand, is there any external factors that are going on? Are there any underlying reasons for the situation occurring? Be supportive, so work together with the individual to create a plan, provide continuous support or training, what might be available, and follow up seeking to improve the individual's performance. So have regular check-ins with the individual. Really important if we think again back to the the art of conversation is to be candid. So have honest and straightforward conversations with the individual in question. Provide specific feedback that has a clear message that the individual easily can understand that. And also, the last point there is really important to be fair. So, gather the facts and the evidence and make sure that you have that fully clear in advance of going into the conversation and that you know exactly what might have happened in the event that the individual queries that with you. So, just to chat about probationary periods, then, when we're talking about low performance. So, anyone who might be new to a people manager role or new to your organization, a probationary period can be at the beginning of an individual's employment and can allow an employer to assess the individual's suitability for their role and to address any concerns early in the employment relationship. Probationary periods were legislated only recently in Ireland. Prior to that, they could have been included from a contractual perspective, but they weren't defined in employment law. So they were introduced last year. And what has been legislated is that where an employment is subject to a probationary period, the period must not exceed 6 months. The probationary period may, on an exceptional basis, be extended or so be longer, but it must be in the interests of the employee and must not exceed 12 months. This is all still very new from a legislative perspective. So I often get asked, what does in the interests of an employee mean? And it might mean 101 things. It might differ and vary for every individual or organization. And we really are yet to see case law on the topic. It's important to try and consider that objectively if it is in the interests of the individual in the event that you are looking to extend that. On the topic of probationary periods when it comes to contracts, in the event that your organization gives fixed term contracts, it's been legislated as well that the length of the probationary period must be proportionate to the expected duration of the contract. So what that means in reality is, if you're giving a 9-month fixed term contract, would a 6-month probationary period be reasonable? Probably not, because it's, for more than half the 9-month duration in total. So just to determine what would be proportionate for the individual contract and the nature of the work as well. So moving on to best practice when it comes to probationary periods. Again, I appreciate there's a lot on the slide here in front of you right now. Don't expect you to run through it straight away while I'm chatting, but it is just a good summary that you can refer back to at a later date in the event that you do need to manage someone's employment or performance during their probationary period. So first up, it might seem a little bit straightforward, but if the probationary period isn't included in the contract of employment and it doesn't state the duration, it does not exist. So really important that it is there, black and white, and that there's no ambiguity, that the individual knows their employment is subject to a 6-month probationary period, for example. As part of probationary periods, it's really important that the individual is met with on a regular basis, and that they're given feedback on all aspects of how they're getting on in their role. So it's really important to give that constructive feedback, credit where credit is due, give the positive aspects and give examples. And then, of course, where there are concerns that have been identified and the individual does need to close out on that, make sure that they're given that information and that it's explained where they need to improve. So taking from that, then it's important to identify the goals that need to be achieved within the next review period, making sure that the individual is being given any support or assistance that might be available to them. So you're genuinely trying to make sure that they are given the opportunity to improve. Really important, even though it might be in the contract, that you are advising the individual that there is the option to extend the probationary period in the event that it's in the interests of the individual. And also, if the concerns still are there, that there is the risk that the probationary period might be deemed unsuccessful, and as a consequence, the employment may come to an end. Like with most HR processes, really important that you're documenting those discussions and you're sending a summary in email afterwards, just to make sure that there is kind of a paper trail in that regard. In the event that the individual has been unsuccessful and they fail to reach the standards required, and taken into consideration that you followed those best practice steps and you've regularly met and given them the opportunity to improve, the individual can be invited to a final review where they can be advised that their probation has been unsuccessful and that their employment would come to an end as a result. It's really important that that does not come to as a shock to the individual in question. And again, everything is confirmed in writing thereafter. What I would say on the topic of probation management, there was case law recently, and it's been spoken about a lot since then in relation to an employer who had an employee whose contract did include a clause that said that employment within probation can be terminated for no reason. And that was upheld within the Court of Appeal here in Ireland, that when there are performance concerns, the individual's employment or probation can be ended without having to go through the full process, fair procedures, natural justice, etc. However, what I would highlight is that what we do here in Deloitte, for example, and what's considered best practice is that employers should still adhere to what's considered good HR practices. So if you terminate for no reason at the first meeting within a probationary period, that is going to probably come as a shock to the individual. And I think if we think about best practice, nothing should be a shock to the individual. They should be fully aware of what's going on. So this is a summary of what best practice would look like, and something that we do here in Deloitte as well. So just moving on then to performance management, and essentially when any concerns arise when someone has completed their probationary period, that could be, at 9 months, it could be a year and 9 months, or 9 years. It could be different for everyone. So managing performance, it's a general term that can be used in many different aspects or many different ways. And it contains a number of different elements that essentially make up successful people management. So setting goals, standards, reviewing performance, and providing feedback to team members as well. Something just to highlight, as I mentioned, probationary periods recently became legislated in Ireland. Performance management is not legislated in Ireland, so there's no requirement to have a defined performance management process in place. But there are lots of benefits of having a performance management process in place. And some examples are included in the slide there in front of you now. I've also included some examples of how an organization might be able to implement a successful performance management process within an organization. So again, at a later date, if you want to refer back to this slide, it might give you some food for thought. Something that I would like to highlight as part of today's discussion as well, and one that I often get queried with me, is that performance management processes do not have to be linked to pay or recognition or anything like that. They can be completely separate processes. Now, it's quite often that organizations do link them because it's nearly kind of killing two birds with one stone. But they do not need to be linked, and it might be something that you do at a different stage within the year and then have your separate pay review period at another stage. That's absolutely fine. So just running through, I guess, a bit more kind of practical steps and as to what it can look like in reality in terms of managing performance. So best practice is to try and deal with performance concerns on an informal basis in the first instance. So I have a summary there in front of you, some steps that can be taken to deal with it informally. So, provide your feedback, make sure there's clear expectations and timeframes. Explore, are there any underlying reasons? Is there anything going on at home with someone that might be impacting their performance, for example? Continuously give support. Make sure you're including your feedback in writing, that it can be relied on at a later date if needs be. Make sure that the individual knows there's a concern, and that there's no surprises. Make sure that the feedback that you're receiving is consistent across all aspects of the individual's role, or is it one particular area they might be struggling with? And then the last point there, number six, just to take note that if performance doesn't improve after taking the informal approach, you can initiate a formal performance approach, which is typically done by way of what's called a performance improvement plan, or commonly known as a PIP as well, which I'll move on to discuss now in a little bit more detail. So if a situation does arise where your team member doesn't meet the minimum requirements for their role, an employer may choose to implement a performance improvement plan. It's not a requirement, but PIPs are becoming a common tool utilized by employers to manage cases of performance, or sorry, poor performance, I should say. It's not a legal requirement, and there's no legal definition of what a performance improvement plan is either. But essentially, what it can be understood to be is a documented plan which outlines the improvements in performance required for an individual and the time frame in order for them to achieve their goals. Um, and on the slide I have in front of you now, I've kind of included three top tips, I suppose, in terms of implementing a PIP within an organization. So number one, having clear and concise objectives and measures outlined within the plan for the individual in question, making sure the individual has the opportunity to improve. That opportunity, that time frame might be different for every organization, or even with it for every role within the organization. So just to bear that in mind. And really important as well that you're giving the individual the support, giving them access to their team leads, giving them access to training, shadowing, whatever it might be, to make sure that they're given every opportunity to close out on the gaps that have been identified. On the right-hand side of this screen there as well, I just have included some common performance concerns that you might see pop up. So, attention to detail, time management, a lack of commitment, communication, they're all examples of what can be incorporated into a PIP if needs be. So moving on then to dignity at work or conflict in the workplace. I guess when working with people, there's always going to be sources of conflict that can arise during the course of our day-to-day working lives. And managing conflict is an integral part of a manager's role. I guess to a large degree, it's about good communication, providing ongoing feedback and effective coaching and support. But it's also about recognizing good work and effective performance management as well. So in terms of summarizing this topic for you, so, where can potential sources of conflict arise within the workplace? There can be disagreements, different working styles, unclear expectations or roles and responsibilities, email etiquette, or etiquette over the likes of MS Teams. Now we're in a bit of a different working world. A lot of people are working virtually. That might be something that you're seeing more and more of. And quite often it can just be a personality clash. Um, so how does a people manager resolve an issue like this when it arises? I guess it's what I would say is it's important to try and be mindful of what's going on. Are there any simmering tensions arising within the team? Can you try and nip something in the bud before it becomes more serious? Um, Good people management is fundamental in terms of, fostering a positive working relationship within your team, spotting early signs of disagreements, and initiating early intervention where necessary. So if you see someone responds back to a team member on email and that you don't think that the manner in which they spoke back to the individual was appropriate, bring that to the individual's attention, highlight it to them, and that, it may not be deemed acceptable in terms of communication, and for them to bear that in mind going forward. So try and nip that in the bud there and then. So, you can try and avoid having it occur at a later date and create something a little bit bigger. When we talk about dignity at work, I think it's important for us to fully understand what that actually means in the context of the workplace. Um, so all individuals have the right to work in an environment that's free from harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, and where each individual is respected. It's considered best practice for an employer to be committed to implementing and promoting measures to protect the dignity of its people and to encourage respect for others at work. And that's commonly done by introducing a dignity at work policy that will have your guidelines and your procedures when it comes to dignity at work matters. So when we talk about dignity at work as well, I'm going to move on to talk about the definitions in a second, but it's really important to take note that the intention of what's considered the perpetrator of the behavior is irrelevant. The fact that the perpetrator had no intention themselves of bullying or harassing someone is no defense. And it's the effect of the behavior on the person in question is what's important. So that's really, really important to take note in the context of dignity at work. And when we look at the definitions of bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment in the workplace. The terms bullying and harassment, they're very interchangeable and can often lead to a misunderstanding of what each one relates to. But again, in the context of the workplace, there are legally distinct concepts. So a behavior can be deemed either bullying or harassment, not both. And therefore, it's important as people leaders to understand the differences. So if a team member comes to you and asks for some guidance or says, I feel like I've been bullied, I feel like I've been harassed, that you can actually kind of give them guidance on what that means. So when it comes to bullying, bullying is defined as repeated inappropriate behavior, whether direct or indirect, verbal, physical, or otherwise, conducted by one or more persons against another or others at the place of work and or in the course of employment, which could be reasonably regarded as undermining the individual's right to dignity at work. Really important to take note because workplace bullying is defined as repeated inappropriate behavior, that an isolated incident cannot be defined as bullying, but still an isolated incident of unacceptable behavior may be considered an affront to one's dignity at work. Then we move on to the definition of harassment. So harassment is defined as any form of unwanted conduct related to any of the discriminatory grounds, and being conduct which in either case has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity and creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for that person. And the 9 grounds I have summarized, or I have included there on the slide as well. So it's gender, civil status, family status, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, race, and membership of the traveller community. And that's defined in the Employment Equality Acts here in Ireland. Different to bullying, harassment can be an isolated incident. So it doesn't have to be repeated. Of course, it could be, but it can be an isolated incident. And the last definition then is in relation to sexual harassment, which is obviously very similar to harassment, but it's any form of unwanted verbal, non-verbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And again, that is outlined in the Employment Equality Acts. So just to touch on dignity at work and what behavior, inappropriate behavior might look like in the workplace, I have in front of you now some examples of obvious inappropriate behavior, but what I actually wanted to kind of highlight was the less obvious inappropriate behavior that might not necessarily stand out or spring to mind. So just some food for thought. Again, you might want to look at it back at a later date, but they are just some less obvious inappropriate behavior examples. And, if they're continuous, they may be deemed bullying, for example. Moving on then to negative impacts, the likes of bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, or an affront to dignity at work can have on an individual, but also the organization. So it can affect, an individual's physical or psychological well-being, but it also can have a lot of organizational effects as well. So, again, like the previous slide, the obvious inappropriate behavior, the physical and psychological examples here, they might be kind of quite obvious to most of today's attendees, but something that might not necessarily have sprung to mind is the impacts or the negative impacts it can have for an organization. So, there can be a rise in sick leave, or on the flip side, general absenteeism. There can be a tense environment or atmosphere amongst employees, low morale, loss of job satisfaction, increase in employee turnover, loss of employee respect, and the worst case scenario then as well, costly legal proceedings in the event that a claim is taken to the Workplace Relations Commission, for example, and a risk to the organization's public image as well. By word of mouth, you might have an employee that says, I wouldn't recommend that organization to work for, but also something to bear in mind now that the majority of claims taken to the Workplace Relations Commission are no longer anonymized. So your organization's name may be attached to a claim in that regard. So moving on then, I just wanted to include some points in relation to dignity at work in a more modern and virtual workplace as well, and where we see it in Deloitte as well, that issues can arise. A common one is what one person thinks is banter, another person doesn't think is acceptable. And if we think back to a few moments ago when I was saying that it's the intention of the perpetrator is irrelevant, it's how the individual perceives the behavior is what's important. So banter can cause a lot of dignity at work issues for organizations. Some other examples might be, commenting on an individual's background when they're on camera, um, not responding to IMs that you've seen, making jokes that are offensive to one team member or a group, whether that's by word, email, or image, sending inappropriate emojis or GIFs, again, quite an increased thing in this virtual working world we're all in now. Isolation, so going for lunch with a specific group and maybe not asking one particular member of the team. Um, moving on there, commenting on an individual's social media activity, or yawning on a virtual call when someone's speaking on a continuous basis. So just again, some real life examples that, might not spring to mind as being potentially an affront to someone's dignity at work or unacceptable behavior. But I think just useful to highlight in terms of the modern and virtual world that the majority of us are working in now. Another one that I wanted to highlight before I move on to the last slide on dignity at work is around people management versus bullying and harassment. So as people managers, sometimes we're hesitant to, let's say, give constructive feedback because we might think, oh, they're going to say I'm bullying them, I'm harassing them. But it's really important to know that, being a people manager, giving feedback is, part and parcel of your role. And as long as you're providing fair and constructive criticism to an individual's performance, conduct, or attendance at work, that is not going to constitute bullying harassment. That's not to say that someone might not make an allegation that, your feedback on their performance is deemed bullying. But as long as you have the evidence that it was considered to be fair and constructive criticism, then you will be fine. Also important to highlight that reasonable essential discipline arising from good management of performance of an individual at work is absolutely fine. It's also absolutely fine to express differences of opinion strongly. Of course, conduct should be appropriate, but you absolutely can express differences of opinion and it's not going to constitute bullying or harassment as long as it's appropriately done. Any actions that are taken which can be justified as regards to the safety, health and welfare of work at people, legitimate management responses to crisis situation which require immediate action, or complaints relating to instructions issued by a team lead, assignment to duties, terms and conditions, or any other matters that might be referred further under the organization's policies and procedures. So just again, a quick summary. Appreciate there's a lot again of text on this slide, but I mentioned earlier a lot of organizations adhere to the requirement to be committed to providing respect and dignity for their workforce by implementing a dignity at work policy. And the procedures, an organization's procedures can be contained within that policy. All individuals within a workplace have the right to make a complaint if they feel they've been harassed, sexually harassed, or bullied. And that's again as a consequence of those definitions being defined in legislation. Best practice is to have both an informal and formal procedure to deal with those matters when they arise in the workplace. And the slide in front of you now gives you a summary of best practice procedures when it comes to dignity at work matters. There is a code of practice established on the prevention of bullying at work, and they recommend that you implement what's considered to be called the initial informal procedure, the secondary informal procedure, and then the formal procedure. So that just gives you an overview and some guidance if you're looking to implement a dignity at work policy following today's session, or even if you're looking to review your current dignity at work policy. So just moving then on to our last topic for today, being well-being, and I think a really interesting one. And I know in my role in employee relations here in Deloitte, it's always at the forefront of everything we do. And I guess what I want to highlight today, and this is going to be different for every organization, but to take note that, as an employer, as an organization, we really do have the potential to improve the lives of workers and create environments that sustainably support individuals nowadays. So Deloitte released a global human capital trends report this year, which highlighted 3 steps that employers can take to meaningfully improve their workforce's well-being and ultimately deliver an impact to their bottom line. So I'm going to run through those at a high level with you today and give you some examples before I move to some practical steps that you could take away from today's session and potentially quickly implement. But just to highlight, if anyone is more interested in reading more on the global human capital trends, I have a link there on the slides and a QR code so you can have a look at that at a later date, because there is absolutely a lot to digest when I run through this information. So the first tip is around, mindset shifts to help organizations to improve their workforce's well-being. So really what that's about, to summarize, is, to try and remove what would have been considered legacy thinking in relation to well-being. So, try and remove that and try and implement forward thinking in respect of your workers' well-being. So what might have been the case previously is that organizations might have thought well-being was about finding a balance between work and life. And look, that's still there absolutely to some degree. But if we think about it in a real forward thinking perspective, work can be considered as a detriment to an individual's well-being. So how do you as an organization make sure that you're supporting your individuals as best as possible to make sure that the work that they do on a daily basis is not a detriment to their life or to their well-being. Again, if we revert back to the legacy thinking, you know, traditionally well-being would have been could have been seen as the responsibility for of the individual themselves, when in fact it's actually a shared responsibility. Organizations need to be accountable for their individuals' well-being and the environment in which they give to their workers to make sure that their well-being is protected as best as possible. And again, if we think back to the legacy thinking in relation to well-being, one of the thought processes might have been was the best solution was to offer perks and benefits to support individuals' well-being. When in fact, if we think about that now going forward with a future focused mindset, it's actually about organizational structures that are implemented which can impact an individual's well-being. So, trying to have measurable outcomes, and having designs in place that are assisting with your individual's well-being. And a way to do that can be followed on to my second tip here, is to measure well-being in a meaningful way, the best way you can within your organization. And I appreciate, today's attendees and the types of organizations you come from. So you're not going to have big databases to be able to record, all this information, or, specific maybe software tools to collect the information. But there are lots of ways that an organization can collect data, self-reported data on all aspects of an employee's well-being. But I suppose what's critical in doing that is that once you obtain that information, that you create a holistic approach to your current state of well-being, and what your real-time outlook on that is, and then any steps that you can take in order to have, some quick fixes. Some might take a little bit longer. If you can put a plan in place to assist with that. And of course, some requests or suggestions around well-being might just not be a runner, and that's also totally fine. But if that is the case, what I would encourage is to communicate back to your workforce on why that might be the case for the particular organization. And then if I move on to my third tip here, and again, it's connected to the last one. Once you've got that data, to identify the biggest opportunity areas and to build momentum on that for your organization. So there's kind of two tables in front of you now on the slide, and the left being the work detriments that would have affected workers' well-being, and why, and on the right hand side, there's examples of how that could be the case. So leadership, how your leaders behave, how your people managers manage your teams. Are they micromanaging? Is there a lack of recognition? Is there a lack of empathy? That is going to impact your team members' well-being. So something to bear in mind. The next one being around design of work, how you're organized. So are your team members consistently overburdened? Do they understand what their potential growth opportunities might be within the organization? Again, all kind of tangible examples that you can take on board and try and progress to assist with the well-being of your workers. And the last one there is around ways of working. So how you as an organization get the work done. Is there an expectation for your workers always to be available and always online? Are they being contacted late in the evening? Are they being contacted on the weekends? Or are they even working on the weekends off their own accord? And to understand why that might be happening. Constantly switching tasks. That's something that might be a detriment to a worker's well-being. I appreciate some of today's attendees might be from particularly small organizations, and some workers might wear a number of different hats. And that's absolutely fine as long as the individual knows that that's expected of them and that's within their remit from the outset. Because, an individual might get very frustrated all of a sudden if they feel they're being asked to do tasks that are outside of their remit. So it's important that that clear expectation is there from the outset. And the last point there, not being able to make decisions on their work and how they do it. Is there autonomy? The ways of working. If you have a team member who drops their children to school in the morning, is it possible that they start work at 9:30 as opposed to 9 a.m.? Or, if you are set up for remote working, can they work from home on a Friday so they don't have to be, in rush hour traffic on a Friday evening for 1 hour? So they can start their weekend earlier with their children and with their family. So just some examples. And what I would say is, anything that might come out of a survey or, an engagement activity to try and understand what's important for your workforce, try and prioritize those areas. Because everyone will be different, every organization will be different, and even your cohorts of workers within the organization might be different. But just to try and prioritize what comes out in those kind of surveys, for example, and those data points, because that will have the greatest impact on your workers' well-being. And sorry, just one last flag before I do move on to the practical steps, and hopefully we have some time then for Q&A as well, is just to highlight that Deloitte Global did carry out a survey this year with Gen Zs and millennials. So I think it was about 14,500 Gen Zs and over 8,000 millennials across 44 countries. And their responses within that survey reveal how the disruptive events over the last few years have shaped their lives and their views, and the ways of working. And while, there was an acknowledgement that there has been some positive changes, it was also noted that many are still deeply concerned about their futures going forward. So, you can see there on the left-hand side, almost half of Gen Zs say they feel stressed all or most of the time. So that's particularly concerning because, that is the biggest cohort of workers that can come into an organization at this stage. You'll see below that women are more affected than men. And those with a disability indicate higher stress levels too. So that might be food for thought in terms of, do you have flexible ways of working for women within the workforce? And are you able to implement any other additional measures that might help reduce stress for women or those with a disability, for example? And then on the other side of the screen, it highlights that 3/4 say concerns about their mental health contribute to anxiety or stress, and work is a consistent challenge. So just the bottom graphs to call out are examples of what individuals felt was stressing them out within the workplace. Um, so you can see there the Gen Z are the blue graph and the millennials are the green. So poor work-life balance, pretty similar, 74 and 73%. Another interesting one, I think, is about the inability to be one's authentic self at work. So that's higher for Gen Z. 64% felt stressed about that. And I think that's a really interesting point. Because we want our workers to be their true authentic self within the workplace. Um, so again, that's a lot to digest, a lot on the slide. In the event that you are interested in kind of having a look at that in more detail, you can check out the global survey with Gen Zs and millennials. Just in addition to that, only last week when I was preparing for today's webinar, I also came across the CIPD's Health and Wellbeing at Work report for 2023. That report outlined that workplace absences have soared to the highest level in over a decade. And now, while this is in the UK, the average rate of employee absence due to ill health has risen to 7.8 working days per annum in the UK. So look, I'm sure Ireland would be somewhat similar. And the upsurge in the absence is considerably higher than what was seen pre-pandemic, which was 5.8 days. So it's just showing that, absence is higher. Well-being is so important, and how organizations can have a shared responsibility in that is really fundamental. And what I've done here is included some kind of practical steps from a well-being perspective in what you, in your role and your organization, might be able to do following today's session. So try and remove those legacy thinking aspects when it comes to well-being. The workforce generation are different. We have the Gen Zs coming in, but also the pandemic had a huge impact on that, even for the different cohorts of workforces. Have a survey, ask your people what's important for them. That will increase your engagement. Try and implement, a systematic and preventive approach to workplace well-being. Try and establish an open and supportive culture where your people feel that they can come forward and speak to their managers about how they're feeling. And what might be helpful for them. For example, if there's flexible working options, it might make a huge difference to someone that they can start at 9:30 to 9. So something that simple, and if it can be easily implemented, it might be something really good to take away. Have a think about your organization's total reward and what's important to your workforce. That's going to be different for every organization. And as I mentioned, it might be different for different workers within the organization. So, for example, are pensions really important to your workforce, or is it extra holidays to spend with their family at this point in time? Try and consider low cost benefits that might be able to be implemented. So, for example, an employee assistance program, often called an EAP. I think I read a stat within the CIPD report there recently that something like 74% of organizations have an EAP plan in place for their employees. So if you don't, that might be something that you want to explore. Another really good one at the moment that is becoming more popular is offering online doctor subscriptions. So your employees can go to the doctor quicker and for cheaper. And they might just need an antibiotic quite quickly, or they might need some sort of medication, and it might just be able to be getting, it might be a bit more effective than waiting for a physical appointment with the GP clinic. And another useful one might be that you might look to implement free sanitary products in your bathrooms in the office as well. It's really important to encourage work-life balance. So if someone is, sending emails really late at night, acknowledge that there's no expectation, or for them to cease, if that is the case and they're not working flexible hours. Another really good one around well-being kind of is to acknowledge and celebrate well-being, inclusion, or diversity kind of dates in the calendar. So World Menopause Day is actually coming up soon on the 18th of October. We're going to be doing a bit in Deloitte. Is there a free webinar that you might be able to direct your employees to so they can gain some further awareness? Pride Month is in June every year. Maybe you could take away from today's session of what you're going to do next month. How are you going to have flags in your office? Even little things like, putting the colors into your organization's logo, having cupcakes in the office, anything like that. And yeah, provide guidance where you can and when appropriate. So, for example, when World Suicide Prevention Day comes up, circulate details to your workforce on the relevant bodies who can help. If we think about the the work environment, do your team members have what they need to work successfully and comfortably at home? Would a laptop riser be a really a simple thing that could be implemented so they have more comfort, and maybe they're not looking down and at having a strain on their neck, for example? Do they need an office chair, wireless headphones? Things like that. They might not be huge costs to an organization, but might make a huge impact on the individual's working from home environment. Performance management and recognition, like we spoke about earlier, really important to give credit where credit's due. And a thank you and a well done can honestly go a long way. Second last one, invest time and training in your people leaders. As the old tale goes, people leave managers and not organizations. So really important that your people leaders are equipped to deal with these difficult situations that are inevitable when working with people. And then the last one is just around social events. And if we think back to the point there on the survey with the Gen Z and the millennials, people are saying, they're stressed because they feel there's an inability to be their true self or their authentic self in the workplace. So try and put a focus on social events and encourage your people to be their authentic self and build relationships within the workplace. So to summarize some takeaways for everyone, try and intervene early, nip things in the bud, take action and manage issues as they arise. If you have dedicated HR within your organization, involve them where possible at the earliest opportunity. Know your policies and procedures, establish the facts, keep written records, be consistent and specific, ensure fairness across the board. Allocate your time to understand and manage a situation. Disciplinary action should never come as a surprise. It's a last resort. From a best practice perspective, be empathetic and supportive and consider your employees' well-being as a priority. And finally, protect confidentiality, because as a people manager, a lot of confidential and sensitive things can be disclosed to you, and it is important that you protect that confidentiality where you can. So I know I am right up nearly to the 11 o'clock mark, but I did want to offer some time for questions. So Clodagh, you might be able to pose some at me if you
Yeah.
can. Great, thank you.
So we have a few questions in the Q&A, so we might have time for one or two anyway.
Yeah.
So how do you manage poor performance when it comes to a person with mental health issues? They have a mental health condition and you suspect they're unwell, and as a result, you're afraid to bring up performance issues.
Yeah, okay, good question. So I think that feeds back into walking in someone's shoes and exploring, are there underlying issues that are impacting an individual's performance? And I think with this particular scenario, if this is unusual for the individual, you've known them for a few years, they're usually a high performer and something's changed, then it probably is something that's going on. Maybe it's their mental health and there's something that's going on outside of work that's affecting that. I think, try and have an effective conversation, explore, is there anything going on? As a people manager, you can ask your team member, look, is there anything that you want to make me aware of that we can help with? And of course, occupational health might be a good suggestion there. If you feel that the individual might not be fit for work at the moment, you might, say as a support, I think it's a good idea if we send you to occupational health and see if we can get any guidance and support that can help you succeed in your role. If you have an EAP, it might be beneficial to guide them and remind them that that's there and encourage them to avail of it, and that they might find it beneficial. So absolutely, I guess to summarize, you do need to address it if you have concerns and you have that gut feeling to bring it to the individual's attention and provide support by Occ Health, the EAP. And fundamentally, if nothing comes out of that, then you just do need to manage the poor performance, best practice informally first, and then engage in the formal process if needs be.
Right, thanks, Leáh. We might take one more just in terms of probationary period. So, and this is going to be relevant to a lot of people on the call here. So in charities, a lot of people are on year-tier fixed contracts subject to funding. So if the funding isn't received, you can't guarantee employment past the 1 year mark. What would be a fair probationary period in that situation?
Yeah, so look, 12 months, 6 months. What I'm seeing and what I'm hearing across the board from kind of HR practitioners is a 12-month contract. Most organizations are sticking with the 6 months. But that's not to say that the nature of the work might be different. So if someone is on a fixed term contract and they're in a really technical role, in the interests of the employee, a 9-month probationary period might be considered proportionate. But I think if it's a standard enough role, there's nothing too technical or specific. I would say probably 6 months is the standard probation within a 12-month fixed term contract.
Okay, great. We might just leave it there in terms of the questions. All of the links we will provide with the slides next week. So for those of you who missed it at the start, we'll provide the recording and the slides and any of the links that Leigh mentioned throughout her presentation. We'll make sure that they're all included so that everybody can follow up. And just to say thank you so much, Leigh. It's great in the chat. Everybody really enjoyed their presentation. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for attending. And hopefully we'll see you again at some of our other sessions throughout the rest of Impact Week. So thanks for joining.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, million. Bye, everybody.